Hi, welcome back. This is episode 2 of how to make a quilter-to-go quilt from start to finish. In the last episode, I showed you the tools that you're going to need to get started, how to cut out, and how to make your block. All of these tools and fabrics I got from my local Spotlight store. Spotlight really is the one-stop shop for the quilter's needs, and they've got a great range of bargains too. Today in this video, I'm going to show you how to join your blocks together quilt as you go using my easy cover strip method. I developed this technique almost 20 years ago because I wanted a fully machine sewn method. I normally put the cover strips on the front, but for this quilt we will be putting the cover strips on the back, so there is no interruption between the blocks, giving a traditional string quilt look with a modern edge. We'll start by joining 2 blocks together. We're then going to join those blocks together in rows, and then we'll join those rows together to make the complete quilt. So let's get started. So take 2 blocks to the cutting mat, place them right sides together so that they are even. Pin the top, bottom and center and head to the machine. At the machine, thread up with a neutral coloured thread, something that blends with all of your fabrics. Now this stitching line won't actually be visible. You can use your standard foot. We need a 1 centimetre or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance with a straight stitch and a length of 3. Use a tape measure or a ruler to double check that your seam is correct. Most times it's the first line closest to your foot. Start sewing with a reverse stitch at the beginning, slide your pins out as you sew, making sure you keep all the fabric edges level and ease it through gently and finish with a reverse stitch at the end. Take your block to the ironing board. This is what it will look like from the front. You can see not all joins are aligning perfectly, but it still looks good. Flip it over to the back and we are going to press that raw seam open. Now it's okay if you catch a little bit of the batting in the seam, that's fine because we are using a nice flat batting. But it's great not to have the batting going all the way through the seam allowance as it reduces the bulk and helps our seam to lay nice and flat. We are now going to cover the raw seam with the cover strip. I'm going to use this pink fabric for the cover strips on the back of my quilt. Now you can use the same fabric as your backing fabric if you don't want the cover strips to stand out, but I want mine to stand out because I want to make a feature on the back of my quilt and it'll kind of make my quilt reversible. To make the cover strips, fold your fabric with opposite selvages together and then fold it over again so the folded edge meets the selvage edge. Align the fold closest to you on the straight line of the cutting mat, extending the raw edge a little bit past a vertical line. Trim the edge straight, and then using the lines on your cutting mat as a guide, cut 2-inch strips and cut as many as stated in the pattern. Open out your strips to double check that they are nice and straight. Now we're going to prepare our strips with a 1-inch or 25mm bias maker, and although we're using a bias maker, your strips don't have to be cut on the bias grain, they're just cut across the fabric from selvage to selvage. Cut the end of the strip into a point. Slide the strip through the bias maker with the wrong side of the fabric facing up towards the plastic side of the bias maker. Use a pin to help slide it through the little gap so it comes out the end of the bias maker. Fold the edges in neatly to get started and press. Now tilt the bias maker up on a 45-degree angle. Bring the iron to the bias maker. Slide the bias maker along the ironing board, working about 10 centimeters or 4 inches at a time, making sure that the edges are folded over neatly, and then bring the iron to the fabric. This is what it should look like. The raw edges are folded over neatly in the middle on what will be the back of the cover strip. As our strips were cut across the fabric, it will be a little bit stretchy and it's going to stretch slightly as you sew it. So I like to remove that little bit of stretch by ironing it again and pulling on the strip as I press. This will give you a nice stable strip to work with. Now mark up your block. Your block measures 9¼ inches and we want our cover strips to finish 1/2 inch away from the top and bottom edge. This is for all blocks that will join onto another block. They can go all the way on blocks that will be on the outer edges of the quilt. I'm going to cut my strips at 8¼ inches long. You will get 4 or 5 pieces out of one strip depending on the width of your fabric. You can put your excess strips under a book or wrap them on a cardboard roll to keep them flat while you are working through your other blocks. To make sure that our strips are going to be perfectly straight and centered, mark a line that is 1/2 inch away from the seam on one side and 1/2 inch away from the seam on the other side. I am now marking a line that is 1/2 inch away from the top and 1/2 inch away from the bottom edge. I can now position my strip over the raw seam in between the marked lines. I'm using a water erasable pen. This gives me a nice dark line that I can easily see, and the blue mark just washes out with a wet sponge, as heat can make the lines permanent. Hold your strip in place with some pins and head to the machine to sew. Back at the machine, I'm going to use a pink colour thread to match my cover strip, and I also have pink in the bobbin. Now you want to use a medium tone thread because you're actually going to see that stitching on the front of the quilt also. So as we have dark, medium and light fabrics, I think the medium is going to be the best tone to just tie them with all of our other fabrics. To sew on the cover strips, I'm going to use an edge stitching foot. You may already have one of these feet, but if not, it's a great one to purchase because it's going to make sewing the cover strips on really easy. You may also have a walking foot with a stitch in the ditch plate. All you have to do is line the guide up on the foot with the edge of the cover strip and move your needle position over slightly so that you're going to have a distance from the edge of the cover strip to the needle that's about 2 millimeters or a little bit less than 1/8 of an inch. If you don't have a foot like this, just use your standard foot and just judge that distance by eye. To start sewing, do a little reverse stitch at the very top edge of the block before you meet the cover strip. Then continue onto the cover strip, easing it through as you sew, removing the pins. I like to use my tailor's awl to help me to ease the fabric if necessary. Finish at the very bottom with a reverse stitch, then spin the block and do the same to the other side. The edge stitching foot makes it really easy, and I know that my stitching is going to be nice and straight. Double check that your stitching is nice on the back. If it's a little bit loose, you'll need to tighten up your top tension. This is what it looks like from the front. The stitching lines that attach the tram just look like quilting lines sewn 1/2 inch away from either side of the seam. So continue joining the blocks together to form the rows. Now you know how to join your blocks together. You're going to keep building on your quilt by joining the blocks together to form the rows. Make sure you have your blocks facing in the right direction before you join them. Start by joining the blocks together. Here's a tip. Before you sew 2 blocks together, pull on the edge of each block. You may have one that's a little bit stretchy and one that is more solid. Sew with the more solid block on top to stabilize the more stretchy block that's underneath. Continue pinning, or if you feel confident, you can join the blocks together without pins. I like to work on all of my cover strips at the same time per row. So start pressing all the seams open and marking up your 1/2 inch placement lines. I work on one side at a time, then spin the row to mark the lines on the other side. I follow this process to join all of the blocks together into rows, then I will join the rows together to make the complete quilt. To make it easy to sew, I roll up one edge and sew down the side of one strip. As I move on to the next strip, I roll up the inside edge and unroll the outside edge and sew down the same side of the strip. I continue doing this until I've sewn all of the strips on one side, and then I flip the row and do the same thing to the other side. You can hold these strips in place with fusible web or a washable fabric glue, but I found it was easy enough to just place the strip inside the guidelines and sew. And here is one whole row complete. This is what it will look like at the top, and don't worry, as these reverse stitches will be covered in the seam when you join the rows together. That's why it's very important to do the reverse stitch at the very top and bottom edge of each seam. Now that you have your rows, you can start joining them together. Start by placing 2 rows with the right sides together, aligning all of the seams. To make sure the stitching lines will line up from row to row, pin them by placing a pin through the stitching line on the top layer 1/4 inch away from the edge. Push the pin through to the other side and line it up with the stitching on the bottom layer 1/4 inch away from the edge also. Squeeze the 2 layers together and push the pin back up through the layers. This is what it will look like from underneath. Now this is an important step, so take your time. Pin your stitching line on the other side of the cover strip and continue pinning each seam in the same way. Sew the rows together with your 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. When you get to the seam, slide the pin out and ease the foot gently over. Sometimes you are going to need to ease the top layer. To do this, push the excess fabric towards the foot and hold the work taut from behind and in front, or use the tailor's awl. Continue sewing the rows together, stopping to adjust and ease through. Take your time. This is what it will look like from the front. Double check all your stitching lines are lining up. Now I'm going to flip it over to the back and press the seam open. It can be bulky at the join because we have a lot of seams aligning at this point, but it will be fine when we sew our cover strip on top of it. Give it a press from the top also. Mark your guidelines. I like to do one side at a time, moving the ruler along as I go, and then I spin the quilt to mark the other side. So grab another strip and you will see that it's not long enough, so we are going to need to make some joins. To do this, place one strip with the right side facing up in a horizontal direction. Place your next strip with the right side facing down in a vertical direction, extending the edges past each other by about 1.5 centimeters or half an inch. Take your ruler and mark a diagonal line from the top left corner to the bottom right corner. Pop in a pin and sew on the marked line with a stitch length of 2.5. Open out the strip to make sure that it is running straight. Now this is a 45-degree join, and we do this to even out the bulk of the seam allowance. If everything is okay, trim away the excess fabric, trimming 1/4 inch away from the stitching line. Press the seam open and cut away the excess corners. Prepare your strip with the bias maker in the same way. When you get to the seam, make sure that the seams are laying flat and then continue sliding the strip through. Before I press that section, I like to just double check that it's all nice and flat and then push it in place and continue pressing. Place your cover strips over the seam. You can pin it in place or you can hold it in place with some washable fabric glue, but I found that it was really easy just to hold the cover strip in place and sew. Sew your cover strips on this longer seam in the same way that you did with your shorter seam, but when you get to the joins, scrape any loose threads underneath the cover strip. It's easier to do this than trimming them away. And then sew across the join. I like to work in sections of about 10 centimeters or 4 inches. I smooth the cover strip in place and ease it through bit by bit at a time. So take your time with it and find your own rhythm, sewing down one side and then spinning around and sewing down the other side of the cover strip. And here are my rows starting to be joined together. As your quilt grows, roll it up so that you can easily slide it through the machine. As the quilt gets heavier, I like to use one hand to smooth the strip out and hold it in place, and then the other hand I put underneath to take the weight off the quilt to help it easily slide through the machine. So keep joining all your rows together in this way. All joined together. I'm so happy with how it turned out, and it looks beautiful on the back as well. So continue joining all of your rows together to make your complete quilt. Take your time, have fun with it, and we'll see you in the next episode where I show you how to finish your quilt with a machine sewn binding. The binding method we'll be using is similar to a regular binding, but it finishes 1/2 inch wide on the front and 1 inch wide on the back to tie in with the width of the cover strips. Oh, and did I mention that it's also fully machine sewn? So I'll see you there. Thanks for watching. Bye.